The heat in the New Mexico territory wasn't just hot, it was mean. It was a living thing, something that pressed down on you from a bleached white sky, sucking the water right out of your bones. For 3 days, Marshal Henry Crawford had been chasing ghosts through this furnace. Cattle rustlers, they'd said. A simple enough job. But the desert didn't do simple. It cooked the sanity right out of a man, made him see things, hear things. So when he first heard the sound, he almost dismissed it. The wind plays tricks out here, whispering through the rock and the sagebrush. But then it came again, high and thin, slicing through the oppressive silence of the afternoon. It was a cry, and it wasn't an animal. It was a child. A cold dread, colder than any desert night, washed over him. He pulled his mare to a stop, his hand already resting on the worn grip of his Colt. 45. Unexpected sounds in this wasteland meant one thing: trouble. Big trouble. He scanned the horizon, a maze of red rock canyons and thorny mesquite. Nothing. Just the endless, shimmering heat. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding small and foreign against the ancient stone. "Anyone out there?" The only answer was the echo, and then there it was again, weaker this time, fainter, like a candle flame about to be snuffed out. That sound kicked something loose in Henry's chest, something old and buried. He spurred his horse, not thinking about rustlers anymore, not thinking about the law. He just rode toward the sound. He found him in the sliver of shade cast by a massive boulder. A boy, no older than 7, maybe 8. His clothes were ripped to shreds, his face caked with dust and dried tears. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and when he looked up, his eyes were a terrifying mix of wild fear and desperate fading hope. Henry swung down from his saddle, his spurs jingling in the dead quiet. He moved slow, like he was approaching a spooked colt. "Easy there, son," he said, his voice rough but gentle. He uncapped his canteen. "You're safe now." The boy's hands trembled as he reached for the water. Henry saw the scrapes, raw and bloody, on his palms and knees. He'd been running hard for a long, long time. As the water touched his lips, the boy started to cry again. Not loud, but with deep, silent sobs that shook his whole body. It was a grief too big for such a small frame. "What's your name?" Henry asked, kneeling beside him. The boy took another sip, his throat working. "Danny," he whispered, so quiet Henry had to lean in. I think it's Danny." He looked up at Henry, his eyes clouded with a terrifying confusion. "You think?" Henry's brow furrowed. "Do you remember what happened, Danny? How you got out here all alone?" The boy's gaze went distant, like he was looking at something 1,000 miles away. A memory that was there 1 second and gone the next. "Shooting," he stammered, his small voice breaking. "Lots of screaming. Mama was—" He couldn't finish. The tears came again, carving clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. Henry's jaw tightened into a hard line. He'd seen it before. A mind so hurt it just shuts off, puts up a wall to protect itself from the horror. In these territories, bandits didn't just steal your cattle. They stole your whole world and left you wandering in the wreckage. "It's all right, son," Henry said, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't have to talk about it." But as he said it, he was doing the math. The nearest town was a full day's ride. The boy was in no shape to make it. And worse, if there was a massacre, the men who did it could still be close. His eyes swept the canyon rims, searching for the glint of a rifle barrel, the silhouette of a man against the sky. They were exposed, terribly exposed. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" he asked, gently checking the boy's arms and legs. "My head," Danny murmured, touching a spot just above his temple. A dark, ugly bruise was already forming there. "Everything's fuzzy." A head injury. That explained the memory loss. Henry had to make a choice, and he had to make it now. He couldn't leave the boy. He couldn't risk the ride to town. There was only one other option. A place he hadn't been in a long time. A place he kept secret for a reason. "Danny," he said, his voice firm, a voice used to making life or death calls. "I'm taking you somewhere safe. My cabin, it's hidden. We can stay there till you're healed up." The boy looked at him, his dark eyes filled with a raw, desperate trust that hit Henry harder than any bullet. It was a look that demanded protection, that promised loyalty. "Will you stay with me?" Danny asked, his voice small in the vast empty wilderness. Henry didn't hesitate. "Yes, son," he said. "I'll stay with you." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the desert in fiery shades of orange and purple, Henry made a small camp. He shared his jerky and hardtack, watching as a little bit of life returned to the boy's face. While Danny slept, wrapped in Henry's bedroll, the lawman kept watch. The desert night was alive with the calls of coyotes and the rustle of unseen creatures, but Henry's gaze was fixed on the darkness beyond their small fire. He was listening for the one sound he prayed he wouldn't hear, the sound of approaching horses. Just before dawn, as the first light touched the sky, Henry was getting ready to wake the boy when Danny suddenly cried out in his sleep. He thrashed for a moment, his eyes squeezed shut, muttering something. Henry leaned closer. "The mark," Danny whispered, his voice thick with sleep and fear. "The lightning on his face." Henry froze. His blood turned to ice in his veins. A mark, a scar like lightning. He knew that mark. Every lawman, every bounty hunter, every poor soul in the territory knew that mark. It wasn't the brand of some common cattle rustlers. It was the sign of the Viper Gang, the most vicious, bloodthirsty pack of animals to ever ride the plains, led by a man they called Serpiente. A man known for one thing above all else. He never, ever left a witness. And if Danny had seen their faces, if he had survived their attack, it wasn't a miracle. It was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. They weren't just in danger. They were being hunted. "We need to move," Henry said, his voice a low, urgent whisper as he gently shook the boy awake. "Right now." As they rode north, deeper into the canyons, the rising sun felt less like a promise and more like a spotlight. Henry kept Danny in front of him on the saddle, a small, warm weight against his chest. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. The boy was quiet, clutching the saddle horn with white-knuckled hands. The partial memory, the lightning scar, had terrified him, pushing him deeper into a shell of silence. Henry didn't push him to talk. What mattered was speed. The Viper Gang was relentless. They'd be sweeping the area, making sure the job was finished clean. They rode for hours, the terrain growing more rugged, more unforgiving. This was why Henry had built his cabin here. The valley was a natural fortress, accessible only through a single narrow pass that was easy to miss if you didn't know exactly where to look. As they neared the pass, Henry reined in his horse, sliding off and pulling Danny down with him. "Stay here," he whispered, pointing to a thicket of scrub brush. "Don't make a sound." He crept forward, his rifle in his hands, his eyes scanning the entrance to the pass. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then he saw it. Fresh tracks. At least 4 horses. They had passed this way, and recently. They were close. So close. A cold sweat broke out on Henry's neck. Had they found the valley? Was his sanctuary already compromised? He crept back to Danny, his face grim. "We have to go on foot from here," he said. "It's not far, but we have to be quiet." They tethered the horse in a small hidden alcove, and Henry took Danny's hand. The boy's hand was tiny in his, and it was trembling. They moved like ghosts through the rocky landscape, the silence so complete that Henry could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. The entrance to the valley was just ahead, a jagged slit in the rock face. They were almost there, almost safe, and that's when they heard the voices. They came from just around the bend, rough laughter and cruel words echoing off the canyon walls. The Viper Gang. They were right there. Henry shoved Danny behind a large boulder, pressing a finger to his lips. He peeked around the edge, his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 men were dismounted, their horses drinking from a small spring. And they all had them, the jagged, ugly scars carved into their cheeks. They were laughing about the job, about the family. The words they used, the casual brutality of it, made Henry's stomach turn. Were monsters in the shape of men. One of them kicked at a small object on the ground. "What's this piece of junk?" he grunted. Another one picked it up. It was a small carved wooden bird, clearly made by a child's hand. Henry felt Danny stiffen beside him. The boy's eyes were fixed on the toy, a flicker of something, a ghost of a memory moving behind them. Probably belonged to one of the brats, the first man said with a shrug. He pulled out his pistol. Let's see if it can fly. He tossed the bird into the air and fired. The shot was deafening, the wooden toy exploding into splinters. Danny let out a tiny choked gasp, and Henry immediately clamped a hand over his mouth, pulling him tighter against the rock. The outlaws froze, their heads snapping up. You hear that? One of them whispered. They drew their guns, their eyes scanning the rocks around them. Henry held his breath. He could feel Danny shaking, could feel the boy's terror like a physical force. They were trapped. One wrong move, one small sound, and it would all be over. For what felt like an eternity, the world stood still. The outlaws listened, their guns ready. Then a coyote howled in the distance, a long, lonely cry that broke the tension. The men relaxed. Just the wind, one of them grumbled. Let's get back to the others. Serpiente will be wanting a report. They mounted up and rode off, their laughter fading into the distance. Only when they were long gone did Henry finally let out the breath he'd been holding. He looked down at Danny. The boy was staring at the spot where the wooden bird had been destroyed, his face pale, his eyes wide with a horror that went beyond simple fear. He was starting to remember. They made it to the cabin just as the last light faded from the sky. It wasn't much, just a small, sturdy structure of logs and mud. But it was built to withstand more than just the weather. The windows were narrow slits. The door was thick oak reinforced with iron. It was a fortress. Inside it was simple and clean. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 cots. It was a lonely place built by a man who wanted to be left alone. For the first time, Henry regretted that loneliness. He was glad for the boy's presence, even under these terrible circumstances. He got a fire going while Danny sat silently on one of the cots, staring into the flames. The boy hadn't said a word since they'd seen the outlaws destroy his toy. Henry knew the walls inside the boy's mind were starting to crack. The trauma was pushing its way through. He made a thin stew from dried meat and beans and coaxed Danny into eating a few bites. The boy ate without seeming to taste it, his eyes still distant and haunted. Later, as Henry was banking the fire for the night, Danny finally spoke. They had a woman, he whispered, his voice trembling. She was singing to the baby. Henry stopped what he was doing, his back to the boy. He didn't want Danny to see the look on his face. Go on, son, he said gently. They made her stop, Danny continued, the words coming in a rush, as if letting them out would lessen their power. The man with the snake tattoo on his hand, he told her to be quiet. She wouldn't. So the boy's voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. A snake tattoo. Serpiente. It was him. He had been there. He'd done it himself. Henry felt a rage so pure and so hot it almost choked him. It was a cold-blooded massacre, a family wiped out for no reason he could possibly imagine. He went to the cot and sat beside Danny, putting a hand on his shaking shoulders. You're safe here, Danny, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. I swear on my life, I won't let them get to you. The boy looked up at him, his eyes swimming with tears. Why? He asked, a simple, heartbreaking question. Why did they do it? Henry had no answer. There was no sense to be made of such evil. I don't know, son, he said honestly, but we're going to survive this. You and me. Together. Later that night, long after Danny had cried himself to sleep, Henry sat by the window, his rifle across his lap, watching the moonlit valley. He wasn't just a lawman anymore. He was a protector, a guardian. This boy, this broken child, had been put in his path for a reason, and Henry Crawford, a man who thought he'd lost everything worth fighting for, had just found a new reason to live. Or if it came to it, a new reason to die. Days turned into a week, and a fragile routine began to form in the hidden valley. Henry taught Danny how to set snares for rabbits, how to find clean water, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. He was a quick learner, his young mind a sponge for the lessons of survival. The boy rarely spoke of the massacre, but Henry could see the shadows of it in his eyes, especially at night when the nightmares came, and he would wake up screaming for his mother. During the day they worked. They reinforced the cabin, built up a stone wall around the small corral, and cleared a patch of land for a garden. It was hard, physical work, and it was good for both of them. It kept their hands busy and their minds off the ever-present threat that lurked just beyond the valley's entrance. One afternoon, while cleaning out his saddlebags, Henry found something he'd forgotten about. Tucked into a small pocket was a piece of folded oilskin-wrapped paper. He opened it. It was a faded photograph of a woman with a kind smile and a man with a proud, tired face. His wife, Margaret, and his son, Thomas. Taken just a month before the fever had swept through Sunset Ridge and taken them both from him 3 years ago. The grief was a familiar phantom, a cold weight in his chest. He'd built this cabin to escape that ghost, to bury himself in a place where there were no memories. He looked over at Danny, who was patiently carving a piece of wood with Henry's knife, trying to recreate the bird he had lost. The boy was focused, his tongue sticking out of the corner of his mouth in concentration. And in that moment, Henry saw it, the same fierce determination his own son used to have. The valley wasn't an escape anymore. It had become a home again, filled with the sounds of a child's life. He walked over and sat beside Danny. "Who was that?" Danny asked, nodding toward the photograph in Henry's hand. "My family," Henry said, his voice quiet. "My wife, Margaret, and my boy, Thomas. He was about your age." Danny looked from the photo to Henry, his expression soft with an understanding that went beyond his years. He reached out a small, hesitant hand and touched the picture of Thomas. "He looks nice," he said simply. The two of them sat in silence for a while, two lonely souls finding a strange comfort in their shared losses. The past was a landscape of ghosts for both of them, but here, in this hidden place, maybe they could build a future. That evening, a storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. Thunder echoed through the canyon like cannon fire, and rain lashed against the cabin. Inside, the fire crackled, casting a warm, dancing light on their faces. Danny seemed nervous, jumping at every clap of thunder. To distract him, Henry started telling him stories. Stories of his days as a young ranger in Texas, of tracking bandits through the mountains, of shootouts and close calls. He'd never told these stories to anyone before, but they flowed out of him now, a way to push back the darkness, both outside and in. Danny was captivated, his fear forgotten. "Were you ever scared?" he asked, his eyes wide. "Every time," Henry admitted with a small smile. "Being brave isn't about not being scared, son. It's about being scared and doing what you have to do anyway." Just then, there was a sound that wasn't the storm, a sharp, loud crack from outside. It wasn't thunder, it was the sound of a heavy branch breaking. Or something else. Henry was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle from its pegs by the door. "Stay away from the window," he whispered, his body tense. He moved to one of the narrow slits and peered out into the rain-swept darkness. At first he saw nothing but the swaying trees and the driving rain. Then a flash of lightning illuminated the valley floor, and Henry's heart stopped. There was a figure down by the corral, hunched over the stone wall they had just finished building. A figure in a long dark coat, his face hidden by the brim of a sodden hat. He was trying to get to the horse. They had been found. The vipers were here. But then another flash of lightning lit up the sky, and the figure looked up toward the cabin. And Henry saw his face. It wasn't one of Serpiente's men. It was a face from his past. A face he thought he'd never see again. Jedediah Kane, an ex-marshal who'd ridden with Henry years ago. A man who'd been stripped of his badge for corruption and violence. A man who held a bitter, dangerous grudge against Henry for testifying against him. And he wasn't just here by chance. He was looking right at the cabin. He knew they were inside. The threat wasn't just outside the valley anymore. It was here, and it had a name. "Jed," Henry breathed, stepping back from the window. The name meant nothing to Danny, but to Henry it was a death sentence. Jed Kane wasn't just a corrupt lawman. He was a vulture. He had a nose for trouble and an even better nose for profit. If he was here, it meant he'd somehow picked up their trail. Maybe he'd been tracking the vipers, hoping to cash in on a bounty, and stumbled across Henry instead. Or maybe it was something worse. Who is it? Danny whispered, seeing the look on Henry's face. An old acquaintance, Henry said, his mind racing. Jed was dangerous on his own, but if he allied himself with the Vipers, if he told them where to find the boy. Danny, I need you to hide, Henry said, his voice low and urgent. Get under the cot, and no matter what you hear, you don't come out. You understand me? No matter what. Danny scrambled under the bed without a word, his eyes wide with fear. Henry moved to the heavy oak door, listening. He could hear the squelch of boots in the mud coming closer. Then a heavy fist pounded on the door. Crawford, I know you're in there. I saw the smoke from your chimney 2 days ago. Been waiting for this storm to make my move. Jed's voice was a gravelly snarl, just as Henry remembered it. Open up. We have business to discuss. Henry didn't move. He kept his rifle trained on the door. Maybe Jed would think he wasn't home, that he'd just left a fire banked. Maybe he'd give up and leave. But Henry knew better. Jed was like a dog with a bone. Don't play dumb with me, Henry, the voice boomed again. I heard things in town, heard about the Rodriguez massacre, and then I heard whispers that one of Serpiente's boys was bragging about how they missed one. A little boy. Funny thing, finding you out here in the middle of nowhere just days later. Put 2 and 2 together, Henry. You've got something that belongs to Serpiente, and anything that valuable to him is valuable to me. It was worse than Henry had imagined. Jed didn't just know about Danny. He saw the boy as a bargaining chip, a piece of gold to be sold to the highest bidder. Go away, Jed, Henry called out, his voice flat and cold. There's nothing for you here. A cruel laugh echoed through the storm. Oh, I think there is. Send the boy out, Crawford, or I swear I'll burn this cabin to the ground with you both inside it. Henry's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. He was trapped. If he fought Jed, the gunshots would be a beacon for any of Serpiente's men in the area. If he gave up Danny, that was not an option. He was caught between a rock and a hard place, with a devil pounding on his door. He had to make a choice, and he was running out of time. The pounding stopped. An eerie silence fell, broken only by the howling wind. What was he planning? Then Henry heard a new sound, the scrape of metal on stone. He peered through the window slit again. Jed was at the corner of the cabin, prying at the foundation stones with a crowbar. He was trying to make a hole, to smoke them out or shoot them like rats in a trap. The man was relentless. Henry knew he couldn't just wait him out. He had to act. He looked over at the cot where Danny was hiding. The boy's survival was all that mattered. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in his mind. It was a terrible gamble, but it was the only one he had. He moved away from the door and went to the fireplace, grabbing the heavy iron poker from its hook. He stoked the fire until it was roaring, the poker glowing a faint orange in the heat. He then went to the back of the cabin to a small shuttered window he rarely used. He silently unlatched it and peered outside. The storm was a perfect cover. He could slip out, circle around, and get the drop on Jed. It was risky. If Jed saw him, he'd be shot down in the open. But staying inside was just a slower death. He looked back at the cot one last time. Stay put, son, he whispered into the darkness. He took a deep breath, swung his leg over the windowsill, and dropped into the mud and the rain. The cold was a shock, soaking him instantly. He moved low and fast, using the trees and the darkness as cover. He circled the cabin, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He could hear Jed grunting with effort as he worked on the foundation. He was making progress. A few of the stones were already loose. Henry crept closer, the poker held tight in his hand. Jed's back was to him. He was completely focused on his task. This was it, his only chance. With a silent prayer, Henry lunged. He didn't use the poker to strike. He used it to hook Jed's leg, yanking him off balance. Jed yelled in surprise, tumbling backward into the mud. His gun flew from his hand, landing just out of reach. Henry was on him in a second, the point of the glowing poker held inches from Jed's face. The heat washed over the corrupt ex-marshal, and his eyes went wide with terror. It's over, Jed, Henry snarled, his voice a low growl. You're going to get on your horse and you're going to ride away from this valley and never come back. You're going to forget you ever saw me, or the boy. You understand? Jed, his face pale in the faint glow of the poker, nodded frantically. All right, Henry. All right. Just take it easy. Henry grabbed Jed's gun from the mud and stood up, never taking his eyes off the man. Get up. Slow. Jed scrambled to his feet, mud clinging to his coat. As he stood, his eyes flickered past Henry, toward the cabin. A strange, triumphant smirk crossed his lips. You should have stayed inside, Crawford, he hissed. Henry's blood ran cold. It was a trick, a distraction. He started to turn, but it was too late. He heard the click of a hammer being cocked right behind his ear. Drop it, Marshal. The voice was cold, calm, and utterly lethal. It wasn't one of Jed's men. It was one of the Vipers. Jed hadn't come alone. He'd led them right to their doorstep. The gamble had failed, and now they were all going to die. The Viper was a tall, lean man with dead eyes and the signature lightning scar marring his cheek. He must have been circling the cabin from the other side. Jed had just been the bait. Smart move using the storm, the outlaw said, pressing the gun barrel harder against Henry's head. But Serpiente is smarter. Jed Kane laughed, a nasty, triumphant sound. Told you we had business, Henry. My business is the bounty on your head. His, he nodded at the Viper, is the boy. Looks like we both win. Henry slowly lowered the poker in Jed's gun, his mind reeling. How could he have been so stupid? He'd walked right into their trap. The cabin door creaked open, and Danny stood there, his small face a mask of terror. He'd heard the voices and had come out, disobeying Henry's order for the first time. No, Danny, get back inside, Henry yelled, but it was too late. The Viper's dead eyes landed on the boy, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, well, look what we have here. The little ghost. Serpiente is going to be very pleased. He gestured with his gun. You two, inside, now. Jed herded them into the cabin while the Viper kept his pistol trained on Henry. The small safe room was suddenly a cage. Jed tied Henry's hands behind his back, pulling the ropes so tight they cut into his wrists. The Viper stood over Danny, looking down at him like he was a piece of property. Our boss has been looking for you, kid, he said. Says you're special. Danny stared back at him, his small body trembling, but his eyes defiant. You're the men who hurt my family, he said, his voice shaking but clear. The Viper laughed. Hurt 'em? Kid, we sent 'em on to the next life. All except you. Seems you've got a guardian angel. He glanced at Henry. Or at least you did. Jed ransacked the small cabin, tossing things aside, looking for anything of value. He found the old photograph of Henry's family and stared at it for a moment. So this is what you've been hiding from, he sneered, tossing it into the fire. Henry lunged forward with a roar of pure rage, but the Viper slammed the butt of his pistol into the side of his head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain, and Henry collapsed to the floor, his vision swimming. Through a haze of pain, he saw Jed pick up the half-finished wooden bird Danny had been carving. What's this junk? He asked, about to toss it into the fire as well. No! Danny cried out, a sound of pure anguish. The boy's reaction was so sudden, so fierce, that both men stopped and looked at him. The Viper narrowed his eyes. Why do you care so much about a stupid toy? He asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. Danny didn't answer. He just stared at the bird in Jed's hand, his expression a mixture of grief and desperation. The Viper strode over and snatched the bird from Jed. He examined it closely. It was crudely carved, but the shape was distinct. He turned it over and over in his hands. And then he found it, a tiny, almost invisible seam along the bird's back. Using his thumbnail, he pried it open. It wasn't a solid piece of wood. It was a locket, carved into the shape of a bird, and nestled inside on a bed of faded velvet was a small, ornate brass key. Jed's eyes went wide. What is it? What did you find? The Viper ignored him. He held the key up to the firelight, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. I'll be damned, he breathed. The old woman. She must have slipped it to the boy before. He looked at Danny, a new, calculating light in his eyes. Serpiente wasn't just cleaning up loose ends. He was looking for this. He turned to Jed. Looks like your payday just got a lot bigger, Kane. This key, this is what he really wants. Henry, struggling to clear his head, felt a new wave of dread wash over him. This changed everything. Danny wasn't just a witness to be silenced anymore. He was the keeper of a secret Serpient was willing to kill his entire family for. And now the Vipers had the key, but they still didn't have what it opened, which meant they still needed the boy, not just to kill him, but to make him talk. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the chaos inside the small cabin. The Viper, whose name they learned was Marco, seemed to be the leader of this small party. He held the brass key in his palm as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. "What does it open?" Jed Kane asked, his voice dripping with greed. Marco shot him a venomous look. "That's Serpiente's business, not yours. All you need to know is that this makes the boy 1,000 times more valuable." He looked down at Henry, who was now slumped against the wall, blood trickling from the gash on his temple. "And you, lawman, you're just a loose end." He cocked his pistol and aimed it at Henry's head. Danny screamed, a raw, terrified sound. "No, don't hurt him!" Marco paused, a thoughtful, cruel look on his face. He glanced from Danny's terrified face to Henry. "Maybe you're right, kid," he said slowly. "Maybe he's useful. Maybe he can help persuade you to tell us what this key is for." He knelt in front of Danny, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Your mother gave this to you, didn't she? She must have told you something. A place. A name. Think, boy. What did she tell you?" Danny just shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I don't remember," he sobbed. "The head injury, the trauma. The memory was locked away, buried deep." "I think you do," Marco hissed, his patience wearing thin. "And we have ways of making people remember." He stood up and gestured to Jed. "Tie the boy up. We'll take them both back to the camp. Serpiente will know how to get the information out of him." As Jed moved toward Danny with a length of rope, Henry struggled to his feet. "Leave him alone," he growled, his voice weak but filled with iron. "He's just a child. He doesn't know anything." Marco just laughed. "He knows enough, and by the time our boss is done with him, he'll be begging to tell us." He turned to Jed. "You ride ahead. Tell the others we've got the package. I'll handle these two." Jed, eager to claim his reward, nodded and hurried out into the storm. The sound of his horse galloping away was quickly swallowed by the thunder. Now it was just the three of them, Marco, Henry, and Danny. The outlaw seemed to relax slightly with Jed gone. He dragged a chair to the center of the room and sat down, keeping his gun trained on them. "We'll wait for the storm to lighten up a bit," he said. "No sense riding in this." Hours passed. The storm slowly began to subside, the thunder moving off into the distance, the rain softening to a steady drizzle. Danny had cried himself into an exhausted, fitful sleep on the cot. Henry sat against the wall, his hands bound, watching Marco's every move. The outlaw seemed confident, arrogant. He thought he had already won, and that, Henry knew, might be his only mistake. Henry began to talk, not begging, not threatening. He just talked. He told Marco about his time as a marshal, about the men he'd tracked, the things he'd seen. He spoke in a low, steady monotone, his voice calm. He was trying to lull the outlaw, to make him see him as just an old, broken-down lawman. Marco listened, a smirk on his face, occasionally adding a cynical comment. "Sounds like you wasted your life chasing ghosts, old man," he said. "For what? A tin star and a shallow grave?" "Maybe," Henry said, his eyes never leaving Marco's. "But I can sleep at night. Can you?" The outlaw's smirk faltered for a second. Henry had struck a nerve. He pressed on. "You think Serpiente is going to share the prize with you? The man who killed his own family for that key? You're as disposable to him as that ex-Marshal Jed. Once he has what he wants, you're a loose end too." "Shut up," Marco snapped, but his eyes darted nervously toward the door. The seed of doubt had been planted. Henry knew he had to time his move perfectly. He saw his chance when Marco, distracted by his words, leaned forward to spit into the fire. It was a tiny shift in balance, a momentary lapse in concentration, but it was all Henry needed. With a sudden, explosive movement, Henry kicked out with both legs, aiming for the chair. The legs of the chair splintered, and Marco tumbled backward with a yell of surprise. His gun went off, the shot going wild and burying itself in the ceiling. Henry was on his feet, his bound hands useless, but his will was a weapon. He charged, lowering his shoulder and slamming into Marco's chest, driving him back against the wall. Marco was strong, and he recovered quickly. He shoved Henry back and swung a fist, connecting with Henry's jaw. The room spun, but Henry fought through the pain. He knew he couldn't win a fist fight with his hands tied. He had to end it now. He saw the fire poker lying on the hearth where he dropped it earlier. He stumbled toward it, but Marco was faster. He grabbed the poker and swung it like a club. Henry ducked, and the iron poker slammed into the log wall just beside his head, with a sickening thud. As Marco raised the poker for another swing, Danny, woken by the gunshot, acted on pure instinct. He grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the hearth and swung it with all his might, connecting with the back of Marco's knee. The outlaw roared in pain and surprise, his leg buckling. That was the opening Henry needed. He lunged forward again, not at the man, but at the poker. He caught it between his shoulder and head, trapping it. Using the leverage, he twisted, wrenching the weapon from Marco's grasp and sending it clattering to the floor. Then, with a final, desperate surge of strength, he slammed his head forward, a makeshift headbutt that connected squarely with Marco's nose. There was a crunch of breaking bone, and the outlaw staggered back, blood pouring down his face, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He stumbled, tripped over the broken chair, and fell backward. His head hit the stone hearth with a sickening crack. He didn't move again. Silence descended on the cabin, broken only by their harsh breathing and the dripping of the rain outside. Henry stood over the fallen outlaw, his chest heaving. He looked at Danny, who was standing frozen, the heavy skillet still in his small hands, his face pale with shock. "You did good, son," Henry said, his voice rough. "You did real good." He knelt down and Danny used Henry's knife, which Marco had dropped, to saw through the ropes on his wrists. The moment his hands were free, Henry grabbed his rifle. There was no time to celebrate. Jed Kane had a head start. He was leading the rest of the gang right to them. "We have to leave," Henry said, his voice urgent. "Now! This place isn't safe anymore." He grabbed the brass key from Marco's open hand and shoved it into his pocket. He then took his old photograph from the hearth, brushing the ash from its surface before tucking it away. They couldn't stay here. Their sanctuary was gone. They were on the run again. As they slipped out of the cabin and into the pre-dawn gloom, Henry knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about running and hiding anymore. It was about finding out what that key opened. It was about turning the tables on Serpiente. The hunt had changed. Now the hunted were going to become the hunters. They traveled for 2 days, moving only at night, sticking to the shadows and the rugged, untraveled paths. Henry pushed them hard, knowing that Serpiente would have his entire gang scouring the territory for them. During the day, they would find a cave or a thicket to hole up in, sleeping in shifts. Danny was exhausted and scared, but he never complained. He had a resilience that amazed Henry, a core of strength forged in tragedy. He was no longer just a victim. He was a survivor. On the third night, they stumbled upon a small, abandoned miner's shack tucked away in a remote canyon. It was little more than a pile of rotting wood, but it offered shelter. While Danny slept, Henry examined the key again by the light of a tiny smokeless fire. It was old, well-made. On its head was a small engraved crest, a sun rising over 3 mountain peaks. Henry had seen that crest before. It was the mark of the old Territorial Bank in Santa Fe, a place that had been bought out and closed down years ago. A place that was now just a dusty, forgotten building on a side street. Why would a woman on the run hide a key to a defunct bank? It didn't make sense. Unless the vault was still there, still intact, still holding whatever secret she had died to protect. It was a long shot, a wild guess, but it was the only lead they had. Santa Fe. It was 100 miles away, through some of the most dangerous country in the territory, but it was their only hope. The next morning, as Henry was scouting the area around the shack, he found tracks. Not the Vipers. Something else. A lone rider heading in the same direction they were going. The tracks were fresh. The rider had passed by only a few hours ago. Henry's instincts screamed at him. It could be a prospector, a trapper, or it could be Jed Kane. Maybe he hadn't gone straight back to Serpiente. Maybe the greedy ex-marshal had decided to follow them, to let them lead him to the prize so he could take it all for himself. The thought sent a chill down Henry's spine. They weren't just being chased from behind. They were being stalked from the shadows. He didn't tell Danny. The boy had enough to be afraid of. Instead, he became even more cautious, doubling back on their trail, using every trick he knew to hide their passage. For days, the feeling of being watched was a constant, unnerving presence at his back. Then one evening, as they were making camp in a cluster of rocks, it happened. Danny was down by a small stream, refilling their canteens. Henry was keeping watch from a ridge above. He saw the glint of metal in the setting sun from a rocky outcropping across the canyon. A spyglass. Jed Kane. He was there, watching them, watching Danny. Henry's first instinct was to raise his rifle and end it right there. But Jed was too far away, the shot too risky. If he missed, he would give away their position completely. No, he had to be smarter. He had to draw Jed in, turn the tables on the stalker. He waited until Danny was back at the camp. Then he made a show of settling in for the night. He built up the fire, making it seem like he was getting comfortable, letting his guard down. He even lay down with his hat over his face, pretending to sleep. It was a deadly performance. He could feel Jed's eyes on him, could feel the man's greed and impatience radiating across the canyon. He waited. 1 hour, then 2. The moon rose high in the sky. Finally he heard it, the soft crunch of a boot on gravel. Jed was making his move, slinking into their camp under the cover of darkness, thinking them asleep and helpless. Henry didn't move a muscle. He controlled his breathing, listening as the footsteps grew closer. He could hear Jed's ragged breathing now, could smell the cheap whiskey on his breath. The footsteps stopped right beside him. This was it. Henry exploded into motion. He rolled off his bedroll, grabbing a handful of sand from the ground and flinging it directly into Jed's face. Jed roared in pain and surprise, clawing at his eyes. In that moment of blindness, Henry was on his feet. He drove his shoulder into Jed's stomach, sending the larger man stumbling backward. Jed's pistol fired, the bullet whizzing past Henry's ear and slamming into the rock behind him. The fight was brutal and silent, a desperate struggle in the moonlight. Jed was bigger and stronger, but Henry was faster and smarter. They rolled in the dirt, exchanging blows. Henry managed to get his hands on Jed's gun arm, trying to wrench the weapon free. Jed slammed his elbow back, catching Henry in the ribs and forcing a pained grunt from him. Just as Jed was about to bring the gun around to press it against Henry's head, Danny acted again. He didn't have a skillet this time. He had a rock. He brought it down with all his strength on Jed's gun hand. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and Jed screamed, the pistol falling from his suddenly useless fingers. Henry didn't waste the opportunity. He delivered a hard, precise punch to Jed's jaw. The ex-marshal's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed in a heap, unconscious. Henry stood over him, breathing heavily, his ribs aching. He looked at Danny, who was standing there with the rock, his face set with a grim determination that made him look far older than his 8 years. "We can't keep doing this," Danny said, his voice low. "Running, fighting. He'll just keep coming. They'll all just keep coming." The boy was right. Running wasn't a solution. It was just a way to delay the inevitable. They had to finish this. "You're right, son," Henry said, picking up Jed's gun. "We're going to Santa Fe. We're going to find out what this key opens. And then we're going to use it to destroy Serpiente and his whole gang once and for all." They tied Jed up securely, leaving him with a canteen of water. They couldn't bring themselves to kill him in cold blood, but they couldn't let him follow them either. By the time he got free, they would be long gone. As they rode towards Santa Fe, a new feeling settled over Henry. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else: resolve. This was no longer about survival. It was about justice. Justice for Danny's family, and vengeance for the life that had been stolen from them. The final act was about to begin. Santa Fe was a sprawling, chaotic city, a world away from the empty desert they had crossed. The noise, the crowds, the smells. It was overwhelming. Henry bought them new clothes, and they did their best to blend in. 2 more nameless faces in the bustling streets. He found the old territorial bank easily enough. It was just as he'd remembered, a grand stone building, now boarded up and covered in dust, a relic of a bygone era. Getting inside would be the first challenge. Getting into a sealed vault would be another thing entirely. They spent a day watching the building, learning its rhythms. A single aging night watchman made his rounds every few hours. The rest of the time, the building was silent and empty. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Henry pried open a back window. They slipped inside, into a world of shadows and dust motes dancing in slivers of moonlight. The main hall was eerie, the teller cages standing like empty skeletons. And at the far end of the room, massive and imposing, was the vault door. It was a masterpiece of steel and brass, covered in complex dials and levers. It looked impenetrable. But there, right in the center, was a small, ornate keyhole. It was a perfect match for the key in Henry's pocket. With his heart pounding, Henry inserted the key. It turned smoothly, with a satisfying click. But the door didn't open. Of course, it couldn't be that simple. The key was only one part of the puzzle. There had to be a combination, a series of numbers that had died with Danny's mother. Henry felt a wave of despair. To come all this way, to be so close, only to be stopped by a locked door. He slumped down, his back against the cold steel. "I don't understand," he said, more to himself than to Danny. "Why would she leave you a key without the combination?" Danny, who had been quietly exploring the dusty office, suddenly called out, "Henry, look." He was holding an old leather-bound ledger he'd found on the floor behind the bank manager's desk. It was a list of all the safety deposit boxes, their owners, and their box numbers. He ran his small, dusty finger down the page. "Rodriguez," he whispered. "It's my name." Henry rushed over. There it was, Maria Rodriguez, box number 319, the name of Danny's mother, and next to it, another set of numbers. Not a combination, a date, August 17th. 317, Henry said, the numbers clicking in his head. August 17th, 817. It was a long shot. Could the combination be that simple? The box number and the date? He hurried back to the vault. The dial was stiff from years of disuse, but it turned. Right to 3. Left to 1. Right to 7. He paused, then continued. Right to 8. Left to 1. Right to 7. He held his breath and pulled the massive lever. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning sound that echoed through the silent bank, the massive locking bolts retracted. The vault door swung open. Inside, it was dark and smelled of old paper and stale air. A wall of small, brass-fronted boxes gleamed in the light from their lantern. They found box 317 easily. It was unlocked. Whatever was inside, Maria had wanted it to be found. Henry pulled the long metal box out and carried it over to the lantern light. It was heavy. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid. It wasn't filled with gold or money. It was filled with papers, ledgers, journals, letters, all in a neat, careful hand. And on top of it all was a single folded letter addressed to the territorial governor. Henry picked it up and began to read. And as he read, the entire mystery unraveled, and the truth was more shocking and more terrible than anything he could have possibly imagined. Serpiente wasn't just a brutal outlaw. Before he was Serpiente, he was Julian Ortega, a respected businessman, a partner in one of the most powerful freight companies in the territory. The ledgers were his. They detailed years of corruption, of smuggling, of extortion, of murder for hire. The company was a front for a criminal empire, and Danny's mother, Maria, had been his bookkeeper and his wife. The letters told the rest of the story. Maria had fallen in love with Julian, but slowly discovered the monster he was. She tried to leave, but he wouldn't let her. She was trapped. So she began to secretly copy his ledgers, collecting evidence, planning to expose him. When she finally found the courage to run away with her children, she took the evidence with her, hiding it in the vault. The massacre hadn't been a random act of violence. Serpiente, Julian Ortega, hadn't been trying to silence a witness. He'd been hunting for his wife, to retrieve the evidence that could destroy him, and he had murdered her and her other children in a cold-blooded rage when he couldn't find it. But there was one more twist. One final, devastating secret hidden in the last letter. A secret that made Henry's blood run cold. Danny wasn't just Maria's son. He was Julian Ortega's son, Serpiente's son. The man who had slaughtered the boy's family was his own father. The boy had the monster's blood running through his veins. That's why he'd been left alive. Not out of mercy, but because he was Serpiente's flesh and blood, his heir. And the man himself would never stop hunting for his son and for the secrets that could bring his empire crashing down. Henry looked over at Danny, who was watching him with wide, innocent eyes. The boy still couldn't remember. And in that moment, Henry knew he had to make a choice. He could tell Danny the truth and risk turning the boy into a man consumed by hatred and vengeance, just like his father. Or he could bury the secret forever and give the boy a chance at a life free from that terrible legacy. But as he looked at the evidence in his hands, he realized there might be a third option, a way to deliver justice and still protect the boy's soul. It would be the most dangerous gamble of his life, and it would cost him everything. They left the bank before dawn, the heavy metal box of evidence tucked securely in Henry's saddlebags. The knowledge of Danny's true parentage sat like a stone in his gut. Every time he looked at the boy, he saw the shadow of the father, the monster who was even now tearing the territory apart looking for them. Henry knew that just sending the evidence to the governor wasn't enough. Serpiente, or Julian Ortega, had deep pockets and powerful friends. He could buy his way out of justice, make the evidence disappear. No, to truly end this, Henry had to destroy the man himself. He had to draw him out, into a trap he couldn't escape. He found a small, discreet boarding house and took 2 rooms. He told Danny to stay put, to not open the door for anyone. Then he went to the telegraph office. He sent 2 messages. The first was to the territorial governor, telling him that incontrovertible proof of Julian Ortega's criminal enterprise would be delivered to him in 3 days. The second message was to Ortega himself, sent to his freight company headquarters. It was short and to the point. I have what you're looking for. The Valley, Sunrise, come alone, or the ledgers go to the law. It was a declaration of war. He was luring Serpient back to the one place on earth Henry knew better than anyone, back to his hidden valley, back to the cabin where this had all begun. It was a place he could fortify, a place where he could control the battlefield. It was suicide, but it was the only way. He spent the next 2 days preparing. He bought ammunition, medical supplies, and enough food for a week. He also bought a second horse. When he returned to the boarding house on the final evening, he sat down with Danny. The boy could feel the tension, the finality in the air. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice small. "I'm going to finish this," Henry said, his voice gentle but firm. "But you're not coming with me." He handed Danny a heavy pouch of coins and a letter. "In the morning, you're going to take the second horse and ride east. This letter is for a man named Sheriff Miller in the town of Harmony. He's an old friend of mine, an honest man. He'll take care of you. He'll see that you're safe." Danny's eyes filled with tears. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not leaving you. We're a team, you and me." "Not this time, son," Henry said, his heart breaking. "This is my fight." "It's my fight too. It was my family," Danny cried the first time he had shown such fire. "That man, he took them from me." Henry knelt in front of the boy, placing his hands on his shoulders. This was the moment, the choice that would define the rest of Danny's life. "Danny," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "there's something I never told you about family. Blood doesn't always make you family. Sometimes it's the people who choose you, the people who stand by you, who protect you." He took a deep breath. "That man, Serpiente, he is your father by blood, but he is not your family." The words hung in the air, stunning the boy into silence. He stared at Henry, his face a canvas of confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. "No," he whispered, "it's not true." "It is," Henry said softly, "but it doesn't have to mean anything. It doesn't define who you are. He's a monster, but you are not him. You are good and kind and brave. You are my son, Danny, in every way that matters." He pulled the boy into a fierce embrace. That's why you have to live. You have to ride away from this and grow up to be the good man I know you are. Don't let his darkness become yours. That's the only way we win. Do you understand? Through his tears, the boy nodded. He didn't understand it all, not yet, but he understood the love, the sacrifice in Henry's voice. Before the sun rose, Henry watched as Danny rode away, a small, lonely figure heading east. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Then he turned his own horse west, back toward the valley, back toward his destiny. He arrived with a day to spare. He turned the cabin into a fortress, barricading the windows, setting up firing positions. He placed the box of ledgers on the table inside, a clear and obvious prize. And then he waited. As the sun's first rays touched the canyon rim on the appointed day, they came. But Serpiente had not come alone. Of course he hadn't. An animal like that didn't understand honor. At least 10 riders, the core of his Viper gang, fanned out across the valley mouth. And at their head, tall and imposing on a black stallion, was Serpiente himself. He had his father's dark hair, but his eyes were a cold, pale blue. He looked at the cabin, his face a mask of cold fury. "Crawford!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the valley. "You have something of mine. My ledgers and my son. Send them both out now and I might let you live." "The ledgers are here," Henry shouted back from a window. "But the boy is gone. He's far away, where you'll never find him." Serpiente's face twisted into a snarl. "Liar! You'd never let him go. He's in there with you." "He's gone," Henry repeated, his voice steady. "And he took a copy of your whole life's work with him. It's on its way to the governor as we speak. This," he gestured to the cabin, "this is just the original. Your only chance to save yourself. But you'll have to come and get it." The trap was set. Serpiente believed the only evidence was right here. He would throw everything he had at the cabin to get it. The gunfight that erupted was like hell itself breaking loose in the peaceful valley. Bullets tore through the log walls, shattering the morning calm. Henry was outnumbered, outgunned, but he was on his own turf. He fought with the cold, deadly precision of a man with nothing left to lose. He moved from window to window, making them think there were more than one of him, his rifle barking, each shot finding its mark. One by one, the Vipers fell, but they were relentless. They pushed forward, using the rocks and trees for cover. Henry took a bullet in the shoulder, the impact spinning him around. He grit his teeth against the pain, reloaded, and kept firing. Another shot grazed his side, hot and searing. He was bleeding, weakening, but he didn't stop. He had to buy Danny enough time. He had to hold them here. Finally, only Serpiente and 2 of his men were left. They made a final, desperate charge for the cabin. Henry shot one of them from the porch. The other managed to light a bundle of oil-soaked rags and toss it onto the cabin roof. The dry wood caught fire instantly. The cabin was burning. He was out of time. As smoke filled the small room, Serpiente kicked in the door, his pistol drawn, his face a mask of rage and triumph. "It's over, Crawford," he snarled. Henry stood waiting for him, his own Colt in his hand. He was swaying on his feet, his vision blurring, but he was smiling. "You're right," he said. "It's over. For you." He didn't fire at Serpiente. He fired at the box of ledgers on the table. The bullet ripped through the metal and then through the sticks of dynamite Henry had packed inside it that morning. The world dissolved into a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar. The explosion tore the cabin and everything in it apart. It was Henry's final act, a funeral pyre for himself and the monster who had destroyed so many lives. He had protected the boy. He had delivered justice. He had kept his promise. 20 years later, a man rode into the town of Sunset Ridge. He was in his late 20s with a quiet confidence and eyes that had seen too much. A deputy marshal's star was pinned to his vest. His name was Danny Crawford. He had taken the name of the man who had saved him, the only father he had ever truly known. Sheriff Miller had been true to his word, and Danny had grown up to be a good man, a man of the law. The darkness of his father's blood had never taken root. The love of his chosen father had been stronger. He had come back to find the hidden valley, to pay his respects at the place where Henry had made his final stand. He found it, overgrown and wild, the scars of the fire and explosion slowly being healed by nature. There was no grave to mark, but Danny stood for a long time in the silence, the memory of Henry's final words to him as clear as if they had been spoken yesterday. He had honored his sacrifice. He had lived, and he had made sure the world knew the name Julian Ortega and the crimes he had committed. The empire had crumbled. The story was finally over. As he rode away, he knew that some families are forged not in blood, but in fire and sacrifice, and that the love of a good man can be a light so strong it casts out even the darkest of shadows. If you were moved by Henry's sacrifice, do us a favor and hit that like button. And for more stories about the heroes of the Old West, make sure you subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments what you think makes a true family. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.